Thanks everybody for joining in. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Thanks everyone for joining in. We will start in just a minute. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for National Policy and founder and director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of more than 175 experts and emerging experts around the world who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. Really delighted that you could join us today for Understanding Defense Offsets, diving in on recent reports. I want to tell you a little bit about the technology we're going to be using, and then I will be turning it over to Sarah to get us started. But thanks so much for joining. We have attendees that have signed up from all over the world in different industries in civil society and government. Great that you could be here. We will enable the Q&A. If you want to put a question into the panelists, please put that in the Q&A. You should also be able to see each other's questions, and you can upvote the ones. If there's ones you really want to hear answered, please do upvote those so that we know that those are the most popular questions there. The chat function is enabled. We ask that if you want to use the chat, that's for the audience members to chat amongst themselves. The panelists will not be using the chat, but we want to make this interactive and a chance for you all to be in touch with each other. I think I also want to quickly explain the interpretation. If you see at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation button. Professor Choi will be speaking in Korean, and Amina will be interpreting that live into English. So if you want to hear the English translation, be sure to hit the English translation button in the interpretation, and you may also at that point want to mute the original audio. Otherwise, you'll be hearing both Professor Choi in Korean and the interpretation. We're really excited to be offering this in 2 languages, and the Korean language interpretation will be made available for a Korean audience because it is quite late there in Korea. I think that is all that I wanted to share at this point. Really delighted to partner with Transparency International in hosting this event, and I'll turn it over now to Sarah Bandali, who will be our moderator and get us going. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and welcome everyone. So my name is Sarah Bandali, and I am the Director of International Engagement at Transparency International UK. And I'm also serving as the Interim Program Director of Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. I will be your moderator today. I'm delighted you've joined us for this webinar where we will discuss the topic of defense offsets. It's not a topic that's often in the spotlight or in fact in the public domain, but it does have huge implications and carries enormous corruption risks. So very briefly, for those in the audience who may not be aware, defense offsets are side deals made between a purchasing country and a foreign defense company. And it's usually tied to a major arms sale. It provides additional technological, industrial, and economic benefit to the purchasing government. And these benefits can range from local production of arms, military equipment, technology transfer, or in fact, economic investment in unrelated sectors. And offsets are designed to enhance the purchasing country's economy and or defense capabilities. So while there are many benefits to offsets, they can also come with significant corruption risks, not least because of the vast amount of money that these defense contracts have, but also because of the opaque nature of these contracts as well. As research from Transparency International Defense and Security, as well as other research has shown, defense offsets have the potential to sway lucrative arms deals. And this is sometimes not in the best interests of the purchasing country. This can lead to national and global peace and security risks, making it harder for countries to build up their military capabilities. There's also times when this money is actually channeled to political parties or elites in questionable ways. Our speakers today will help us better understand how defense offsets work and the corruption risks that can arise from offset agreements, looking at cases from the US, South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates. Our panelists will then recommend ways in which these risks can be mitigated to foster better transparency and accountability in defense offset deals. I'm now pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of experts. First, we have with us Colby Goodman, who is a senior researcher at Transparency International Defense and Security and Transparency International US. We also have with us Jodi Vittori, who is a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and professor of practice and co-chair of the Global Politics and Security Program at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs. And our last panelist is Professor Byung-Ook Choi, who is a professor of national security at Sangmyang University in Seoul and director at the Institute for Security and Unification Studies. He is also a member of the Integrity Defense Committee of Transparency International, Korea. So without further ado, let's turn to our panelists. Colby, I'll come to you first. You've noted some big changes in the defense offset market in the past few years. In addition to highlighting some of the key challenges, what do you see as the most significant corruption risk with defense offsets? And looking ahead, how do you think these risks could evolve, particularly in the relationship between US defense companies and partner countries around the world?
Great, thanks, Sarah. That's a lot. I first want to just say thanks, Jeff, for organizing this briefing. It's a long time coming. And Sarah, thanks for that helpful introduction to defense offsets. And welcome to all the people in the audience. First off, I just want to say, in short answer to your question, Sarah, there's been a big growth in defense offsets really since 2020. And this is after sort of a previous decade of efforts by the EU, the United States, and other countries to sort of minimize defense offsets mostly because of their economic inefficiencies, and specifically, and of course, including corruption. So the first part, I'm just going to give you a little overview. I have some slides of some of the trends we're seeing in offsets and what I'm talking about. So I'm going to share my screen. Second.
That's good, Colby. We can see it.
Yeah, for some reason it's not. There we go. Okay. So here you have a map of all the countries that have some sort of requirement or request from foreign defense companies to provide defense offsets, or sometimes called industrial collaboration or cooperation or compensation, in connection with usually a sort of a major arms deal. Since 2020, there has been a big growth in the number of countries with new policies and approaches. And so those countries that are in sort of the orange color are the countries that have new sort of policies or approaches to offsets. I calculated around 30, and some of these are, offset policies for the very first time, or they've had especially in Europe, they've had an offset policy in the past decade, and they really didn't do much, but now they're engaging much more. So it's important to note that some of these offset policies require a specific strict quota. In other words, if the weapons deal is like $10 billion, let's say 50% of that 10 billion has to go into offsets. So just a quick overview, like in Europe, some of the countries that have these sort of new approaches, Netherlands is leading the way in a lot of ways. Poland, Portugal, Romania, the UK, Bulgaria. Asia, you'll see there's quite a few new ones. Taiwan, Japan, Malaysia, and the Philippines all have new approaches. Gonna go to the next slide here for you. So all of this sort of new demand is really pushing the value of defense offset agreements to a high level. Now, because there's so little transparency on defense offsets, it's really hard to calculate this, but some people do try. So a couple of years ago, there was an estimate that from 2021 to 2025, the total value of defense offsets would be around 371 billion. And really what you're seeing is the rise in defense offsets and industrial collaboration is COVID and Russia's invasion in Ukraine in 2020. These is pushing sort of more self-reliance on defense issues, concerns about global competition, concerns about supply chains, and I think there's a lot of focus on creating the supply chain, not disrupting the supply chain for critical munitions and missiles for the U.S. side, and concerns about Russia and China. But a lot of countries are also elevating that's often sort of what can be like direct offsets, directly related to an arms sale or sometimes the defense sector. But there's also been a lot of push for indirect offsets, which are not related to an arms sale, but often focus out elsewhere within the economy. So the Department of Commerce does a pretty good job of giving you some useful information about defense offsets, and so one of what I have here is in red is the Department of Commerce estimations for total value of agreements for years 2021 and 2022. So now this is based on what U.S. companies report. Now, it's clear that it seems like they're missing some important stuff. So we did our own estimation, which is the orange, and we saw that there's quite a bit more. So we can go into a little bit more detail on that. So in answer to your other questions, Sarah, on some of the key risks, I'm just going to quickly cover three big ones. And I want to just highlight that it's not just, TI doesn't necessarily look at offsets as inherently corrupt process. It's often just the way it's done, the structures, the checks, the lack of transparency. So the first one I want to highlight is these agreements are often sort of done in secretive, sort of opaque negotiations with very flexible inducements. So the offsets themselves are very flexible. Some, in cases that we've ran into, the political leaders will not even involve the government officials that are experts in offsets. They're particularly flexible because a lot of use of indirect offsets, which can be, any sort of thing offered for the investment or technology transfer to sort of sweeten the deal. And the other concern that we've highlighted is that companies don't always provide the cost to the purchasing government, the actual costs for the offsets, and that can cause some problems. That has caused some challenges in South Korea, Oman, UAE, and others. In some cases, the purchasing government had just canceled it because they weren't clear on the costs. Intermediaries or offset sort of brokers or advisors is the common one in the defense sector. And it's, of course, a big one in offsets. So what's unique about the offsets is brokers often play a role in excuse me, in designing, negotiating, and implementing offset deals. And so a lot of U.S. export compliance lawyers have raised concern, and I have like a quote from one of them here where you're seeing, it says, "I've seen circumstances where an offset advisor knowingly recommended that my client provided funding to a company that turned out to be a shell company, and then after they dug a little bit, I found that the offsets were flowing directly to a foreign official, raising corruption concerns. We have a few cases in the report. This one is a particularly telling way of how brokers can use offsets as a way, as sort of a hidden way to funnel money to officials to help win a deal. The one you have here is in India, where brokers were accused of using offsets to sort of launder bribes to help them win a bid to sell military transport helicopters. India did buy the helicopters, and then they actually sort of stopped using them because they didn't have the helicopters didn't have the critical sort of military functions that they needed. The last thing I just want to touch on is the sort of the way offsets are valued in terms of how they're when they're implemented, the offset projects. Governments often use these very opaque, broad formulas to sort of do this valuation. And unfortunately, because of the broad array of offset projects, it can be really difficult for the government officials to really know how to make these evaluations. That opens up the floor for a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of opportunities for fraud and corruption. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to other people's comments.
Thank you so much, Colby. We just had one clarification from an audience member, and I think it was the second slide. If you don't mind going back. So the question is on the value graph. Are those regional estimates of value based on the region of the supplier nation or the region of the recipient nation?
Sorry. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. 1 second. So this one, the question is so these are the estimates based on the value of what they predict what companies are gonna the value of the offset projects. Is
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
if there's further clarification needed, we can take that up. We
Okay.
can take that up a bit later. Thank you so much, Colby. So we've structured this discussion so that each of our panelists are building off of the information provided by the previous panelists. So I'd like to now turn to Professor Choi to expand on what Colby has just presented. And looking at the example in South Korea, which is in a very unique position, as it's not just a major purchaser of weapons, but also as an emerging supplier. And we know offsets have played a role in some of these recent deals, which have certainly stirred up some interesting debate. It would be good to hear more about this and your take on how South Korea is navigating the complexities and challenges of offsets.
교수님.
Okay, anyway, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm Professor Byung-Ook Choi. I'm in Seoul, Korea. Since we have simultaneous interpretation today, I'll be speaking Korean from now on.
하겠습니다. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah touched upon, defense of offset is a controversial issue to everyone and has a special meaning in South Korea. I retired as an army colonel, and during my time in the Korean military, I wasn't really directly involved in the defense industry. However, after retiring, I served as an advisor to various defense-related departments, a police committee member at TI Korea, and as a full-time advisor to the Minister of Defense while on leaving from my university. So this experience I have would allow me to speak on offset deal today from a general perspective. I can say that offset deals have greatly contributed to South Korea's military and economic development. As you know, South Korea is now the 10th largest economy in the world. According to the 2024 Global Firepower Ranking, Korea is ranked as the 5th strong military power behind the US, Russia, China, and India. Korea rose from the ruins of the Korean War in the 1950s to join the ranks of advanced nations from a country that we couldn't even produce a single rifle, but now we have become a major defense exporter, selling fighter jet. So I do believe offset deals have played a crucial role in this military and economic progress. So, for example, when importing weapons from the US, Korea did receive technology transfers. And not only technology transfer, we received, we had the domestic production and assembly of those parts, and that improved our weapons development capabilities. Offset deals accelerated the growth of our defense industry and had a positive impact on overall development of Korean economy.
둘째로 빛이 있듯이 그림자도 있습니다.
Secondly, like everywhere else, where every bright side, there is also a shadow.
부패의 개연성이 크다는
The
것입니다.
potential for corruption I am talking about.
콜비가 이야기한 적이
As
있습니다만
Colby did mention,
F-35A의 전투기의
the
절충교
case
사례가
of the F-35A fighter jet offset deal does say quite a lot. It's quite telling. In the project to select and purchase 40 next generation jet, Boeing was the only, initially the chosen solo candidate. But then later, the decision was turned, and then Lockheed Martin's F-35A, due to so-called national interest and political consideration. This was the largest weapons purchase. The deal costed almost 5.5 billion. Yet the reason for the change still remain classified as military secret. There is a rumor that President and the Minister of National Defense were involved, but then nothing has been confirmed. But returning back to offset, Lockheed Martin had promised to South Korea to provide one military communication satellite and 25 key technologies needed for the development of Korean fighter jet. However, the provision of the military satellite was suddenly cancelled, and they also refused not to transfer 4 key technologies out of 25. While there are penalties for not or failing to fulfill offset deals, they are hardly effective when dealing with a monopoly like Lockheed Martin. DAPA, the Defense Acquisition Program Administration of South Korea, has already decided to bring in 20 more fighter jets, but this is part of the second phase of the next generation fighter project. So evidently, the Korean government has decided to purchase more F-35A from Lockheed Martin once again. The defense industry deals with a vast amount of national funds, and when such projects are decided behind closed door and insisting on national interest, political constellation, and military secret, the potential for corruption becomes a significant problem.
이제 한국의 상황이 역전이 됐습니다.
Now, the situation has changed. What it means is Korea has now moved on from being a buyer to a seller. So back in 2006, Korea's defense export were only around 250 million US dollar, but by 2020, they grown up to 3 billion. And this year, due to global arms race, Korea is expecting to achieve 20 billion in defense export for the first time. The number of export destinations has increased as well from 4 countries in 2022 to 12 last year. So with a great reach over 15 countries by the end of this year. So Korean defense has gone beyond the top 10 defense exporters, and it is aiming to become the 4th largest defense exporter in the world by 2027. Like once Korea was before, countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Australia, India, and Poland are now demanding various offset deals from South Korea, just like we once did. So these include technology transfer, financial support, and local domestic production. But it is known that South Korea also refrain from transferring the core technologies. Offset deals are filled with provisions. And as a seller, South Korea is now offering even more attractive terms to create national wealth through arms sales. Finally, to wrap up my point,
보면
offset deals are an unavoidable attractive system for countries seeking military and economic development. It's inevitable attractive proposal. So therefore, trying to eliminate offset deals might be pretty unrealistic. What is crucial is though that international cooperation and efforts to reduce the potential for corruption. Our Board of Audit investigated the issues with the F-35A, but nothing was revealed. And then later on, civil society raised the concern, but the Korean court ruled that it was better not to be disclosed. The details should be remained for the interest of national security. This shows the challenges of individual countries' effort. I believe that the international community, we need to establish a standard for offset deals, enhance transparent, and compile and publish examples of potential corruption and raise international awareness. Arms deals between nations have a significant impact on individuals' lives and global peace and security. They are not like rice, cars, or smartphones export.
절실하겠습니다.
International cooperation and effort are urgently needed to make sure transparency is in place. So that is my presentation today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Choi. It was very fascinating to hear those insights and perspectives from South Korea. And you've obviously highlighted some very serious concerns about transparency and corruption risks of these deals and the difficulty in exposing this risk. Can I just ask a quick follow-up in terms of how do you see these issues affecting South Korea's broader defense strategy and its relationship with international partners, particularly in the US? And what role do you think public and government oversight should play in mitigating this risk? You talked a little bit about that, but if you could expand, that would be helpful. Thank you.
오케이. 투명성이 약하고 부패 가능성이 높은 무기
Yes, the
거래는
lack of transparency will
여러
cause
차원에서 다양한
various
문제를
problems on many different levels. And I think the most important thing is that it leads to inefficient weapon procurement. We might end up buying expensive weapons and that don't perform well, or paying a lot of money for technology that doesn't benefit them. So in the end, we could acquire weapons that don't meet our military needs, and those wrong purchases could harm both our people and national security. And opaque agreement like those lacking transparency will negatively impact relationships between countries in many ways, as seen with the F-35A. When contracts aren't honored or accountability is lost, the US-Korea alliance and the trust can decrease. So in my viewpoint, this backroom there only increase one country's dependence on another for weapons and security. So really, security elites might engage in policy capture, prioritizing deals that benefit certain individuals or themselves instead of the entire national interest. So this can lead to greater dependency and an imbalance in defense and security between countries. Regarding the public and government oversight, what we can do, in Korea, civil groups, the media, and the various YouTubers play active roles. However, in the defense sector, if information isn't provided or made public, access to this information is very limited. So I believe we shouldn't overly restrict the public's right to know under the guise of national interest, political judgment, or security. So as I emphasize, everyone, I think it is crucial to strength, transparency on an international level, establish institutional oversight processes that meet international standards, and reinforce global monitoring system. And I think that need to be strengthened as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Professor Choi, for your responses, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. I'd like to turn it over to you now, Jodi. You've been a very strong voice in the fight against corruption for a number of years now, and your recent work on sovereign wealth funds dives deep into some of these issues. Could you break down how sovereign wealth funds tie into the world of offsets? It would also be good to hear more about what you've discovered in the UAE on this as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah, for moderating today. Thank you, Jeff, for hosting us, and Transparency International for taking part in this.
I can't hear you, Jodi.
Really? You still can't hear me?
You might need to turn, if you muted the original, Sarah, you might need to change your settings.
Thank you.
Okay. Jeff, I assume that means you can hear me.
Yes, just have to speak slowly.
Yeah, I should apologize. I too started off in the military, and my first assignment was briefing fighter pilots, and I have never learned to brief slowly since then. I blame them, not me. But until recently, I was also a non-resident fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we put out myself and a wonderful scholar by the name of Lakshmi Kumar on illicit finance. We co-edited and co-ran a multi-author, multi-chapter project trying to understand how sovereign wealth funds can be used for corrupt purposes, illicit finance, money laundering, and other threats to good governance regarding those sovereign wealth funds. And we wrote it for non-finance experts, and we used various case studies to highlight key issues regarding sovereign wealth funds and concerns with their governance. One of those chapters that I wrote was specifically on how sovereign wealth funds are sometimes used to be able to fund various countries' sovereign wealth funds, and how that it can affect transparency, good governance, counter corruption, and so forth. So I'm going to share my screen here. It worked earlier. Hopefully it's still working now. All right. Here we go. Hopefully everybody can see that well. United Arab Emirates is unique and interesting. One is because its offset field is especially susceptible to potential for corruption. And I should note that I'm not noting any illegality whatsoever regarding their arms trade and their use of sovereign wealth funds or their use of offsets. But they are ranked a level E in 2019, according to the Government Defense Integrity Index that Transparency International's Defense and Security puts out. A is good, F is bad. It's British, they have an E in there. But anyway, the second highest level of susceptibility to corruption. But within that, there's also interesting because they run and set up two of their sovereign wealth funds specifically to take the proceeds from offsets and put that back both into the Emirati economy and for foreign investment worldwide. And this can be an issue because it can make it even harder to track what's going on with offsets and where they're going and how they're going around the world. So the first of these, and I've put up a slide that highlights sort of the interlocking web of these two key sovereign wealth fund networks. The first network is Tawazun. And Tawazun was set up in the early 1990s by the then Chief of Staff of the Abu Dhabi Armed Forces, Mohammed bin Zayed. People know him better by his initials today, MBZ, and he has now, in the years since, become the overall head of the United Arab Emirates. And that was set up with a Jordanian also by the name of Amin Badr ad-Din. And they set up specifically so that they could take the proceeds of offsets and move that specifically into the Emirati defense industry. The second sovereign wealth fund then they set up in the 1990s is called Mubadala. Mubadala is the third largest sovereign wealth fund in the United Arab Emirates today, and it is the 13th largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It was set up in the 90s, in contrast to what many websites will describe as its origin story. It was set up in the 1990s, again by MBZ and the same Amin Badr ad-Din, with the purpose of taking some of the proceeds of offsets and moving that into domestic civilian economy, as well as overseas. And Mubadala, according to its website today, invests in more than 50 countries worldwide. So just a little bit on the timeline of how this works. It should also be noted that Mubadala, because of the way that various the linkages between Tawazun and Mubadala have worked out, since 2019, Mubadala is in charge of what is essentially a holding company called Edge Group, which in 2020, according to SIPRI, was the 22nd largest arms provider in the world, arms company in the world. Because it's treated as a holding company, SIPRI changed how they were evaluating companies and no longer evaluated companies as a whole, but the subsets of their companies. And so they're no longer listed in the latest versions of SIPRI's largest defense companies. But as a holding company, it was treated in 2020 as the 22nd largest arms provider in the world. So these sovereign wealth funds themselves also can be arms companies in their own right. And not all the arms related companies, I will note, are specifically under that Edge Group. There are other areas, and that Edge Group has grown larger. Now they advertise 160 different military related products. So why does all this matter? What are sovereign wealth funds? Sovereign wealth funds are usually set up by countries that have a lot of natural resource wealth, but not always, but usually for natural resource wealth for a number of reasons. And when well run, they make incredible sense for the country. They're a great asset for countries. But one of the problems we have with sovereign wealth funds is that because they're sovereign, because they're set up by states or sub-state actors, by sub-state actors, things like Texas's sovereign wealth fund or Alaska's sovereign wealth fund, they are often treated as low threat risk for corruption. So if you have an individual who, as a politically exposed person, and if they were invested in a country, they would be given certain scrutiny for money laundering, illicit finance concerns because of who that person is and where they are in a particular regime. If that same person is in charge of a sovereign wealth fund, because it is a state-owned entity, most countries do not check for illicit finance or corruption associated with sovereign wealth funds, which means they are treated as inherently low risk, even if it's run by the same people who would be considered high risk in other environments. Sovereign wealth funds are set up, again, usually for good reasons, usually by states with lots of natural resources. Oil is the classic example. Countries want to diversify their economies, so they take some of the oil proceeds and they will invest overseas to diversify their economies, just like we would diversify our own savings portfolios. You wouldn't want it all in one natural resource or something. Countries are the same. They also invest it because, if oil prices are high, that's great, and budgets are flush. But when oil prices fall, suddenly you have to fire teachers, you have to, close infrastructure projects. And so they can pull some of that money back in to balance out their economies and then to save for future generations, particularly if the oil is going to run out, or if you believe it'll be a stranded asset because of climate change. You want to make sure that there's still some funds coming in. So they're investing overseas and often domestically as well. And it's a massive industry. Per last month, there was about $12.3 trillion in assets under management by sovereign wealth funds in the world. This is a guess. You'll see that it's just a little bit less than all of the assets that central banks owned. So these are tremendously large funds, again, that can be managed very well and transparently, transparently. Norway is always the key example of that, but South Korea also has a well-run sovereign wealth fund. But there's a lack of information about these sovereign wealth funds. I already mentioned that they're often treated as low risk for checks for money laundering, even if they're coming from countries and run by regimes that are known for high levels of corruption and illicit finance. But also many sovereign wealth funds are they're investing in very opaque investments. So they're investing with private equity funds. They're investing with venture capital funds. They're often taking minority stakes in non-listed companies or non-listed real estate overseas. So there's no indication of where they are actually investing, who are the beneficial owners of those investments, say that real estate, who's running those funds, who are those intermediaries. There's a very significant lack of data for the public overall as well, because what information is mostly available about sovereign wealth funds is behind incredibly expensive paywalls. Paywalls like Preqin and paywalls by PitchBook, anywhere $5,000+ a year for the minimum annual subscriptions to these organizations to try to track it. So it's very hard for citizens and very hard for journalists or others to be able to track what's going on with these sovereign wealth funds and who they're investing. And even those groups that try to use data scraping and get information from the sovereign wealth funds themselves, they have a real hard time. And they have to work with what the companies give them or what they can data scrape. They can't know what they don't know. So we're often missing a lot of information. There is an international standard. It was set up in 2008, and it's called the Santiago Principles. It was set up by the sovereign wealth funds themselves when there were concerns about the national security implications of sovereign wealth funds, not due to the arms trade, but just where countries and sovereign wealth funds were purchasing. So if you think today about like the concerns about Chinese sovereign wealth funds buying land near US Air Force bases, those sorts of national security concerns. The Santiago Principles do not deal primarily with illicit finance or corruption issues, and indeed they have not been updated since 2008. They're entirely voluntary. Countries and sovereign wealth funds can choose to abide or not. Mubadala actually is signed up to the Santiago Principles and is graded relatively decently according to it. But the various Tawazun sovereign wealth funds and their sovereign wealth funds kind of change names and go in and out of existence, so they're a little harder to track. They are not signed up to the Santiago Principles, and they are not generally tracked by other external actors who try to grade the quality of governance of sovereign wealth funds, groups like the Peterson Institute. Those principles are voluntary. The grading on them is also self-graded. So the countries decide themselves how they're going to grade themselves. And the organization that set that up has no enforcement powers for how those countries grade themselves, or do they take part, or how robustly they take part. So we have huge groups of money that can be well managed, but often are incredibly opaque. There's no information on, and the little information that is out there and the grades are primarily self-given by the funds themselves. We in the corruption community know that if one wants to engage in corruption and has control in these environments, that this sets up a uniquely challenging environment for corruption. So there we go. Let me just unsave my screen. So bringing up some of the significant issues when we're dealing with sovereign wealth funds and groups like Mubadala, as we have peace and security issues when it comes to sovereign wealth funds because of their role actually as arms providers. We have opacity issues. And if it's hard enough to track offsets, when those offsets are moved into sovereign wealth funds, they can be even harder to track. And sovereign wealth funds themselves, for example, in May, Mubadala was given permission to purchase a investment group in the United States that specifically acts on behalf of 2,000 other investors in real estate, private equity, hedge funds, and so forth. So you're trying to track money going from an offset fund to maybe a sovereign wealth fund, maybe sub funds of these sovereign wealth funds, which may or may not have any visibility to them whatsoever. And just as a side, and to build on what Colby was saying when it came to offset brokers themselves, it's interesting that both of the key offset brokers that are out there were set up by this setup with Mubadala and Tawazun. They were both set up by MBZ and with the Jordanian I mentioned earlier, Amin Badr al-Din. The first one is Chesscore, which is registered in Mauritius, which is an offshore location. and runs out of a Dubai free trade zone, the Dubai media zone, which is interesting because, of course, it's not a media company, it's an offsets company. And the other one that's really interesting, linking to what Professor Choi was talking about, is Blenheim Capital. Blenheim was started, or was linked to an individual in Britain named Richard Grant Rogan. Again, started by the same individuals. It was created with an offset by Lockheed Martin, and it was originally funneled through Mubadala back in the days when Mubadala's prior name was the UAE Offsets Group. So we're seeing this overlap between, the use of offsets, the use of sovereign wealth funds, and their functioning when it comes to the arms trade itself and to facilitating those offsets itself. Again, Mubadala, there's no implications of any illegal activity involved in my discussion here today. And in addition, Mubadala does a lot more than just defense offsets anymore, but both of them were specifically created out of the offset groups in the UAE for those purposes. And so I would argue that we need to be much more specific, not only how the offsets themselves are moving, but how we understand it makes its way through the financial system, because they are incredibly complicated to track and becoming more important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jodi, for those insights, which I think are probably new to quite a few people, particularly the complexity of sovereign wealth funds and linkages with offsets, as well as the challenges and kind of tracking these investments. Just to deep dive a little bit more into what you found out about the UAE's use of sovereign wealth funds and defense offsets. What do you see as the most significant risk these funds pose in terms of corruption and lack of transparency? You touched upon that, but I'd like you to maybe go a little bit deeper into that. And how do you think international regulatory bodies or governments can address these challenges in an effective way?
Sure, the easy questions. UAE itself is a challenge, and one of the reasons I chose to write on it first is because they were the ones that started setting up this process of specifically setting up sovereign wealth funds for the purposes of moving defense offset money. So at least two other countries have now glommed onto this in the last couple of years. One of them is Saudi Arabia. Its public investment fund, which itself has been very controversial for those who are golfers. You're familiar with LIV Golf, concerns about sports washing and so forth. That one's run by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, he's better known as MBS. So Saudi Arabia runs their defense offset program. Their SAMI program, which handles their offsets, is a complete subsidiary of the Public Investment Fund. Likewise, Bahrain recently in 2020 set up their offset situation where, per the Counter Trades Journal, they basically took UAE's offset program and just did essentially a global search and replace, taking out the word UAE and putting Bahrain in it. These countries all allow cash offsets as well, just like UAE does, which is highly problematic that countries, instead of setting up a company, can just pay cash into a fund in certain cases. And we don't know where that money goes through. It goes through all these very opaque investments, and who knows where it comes out at the other end. And I should note, I mentioned that the UAE is an E on the Government Defense Integrity Index. Both Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are an F for susceptibility to corruption when it comes to their defense procurement overall, and their offsets weren't doing so great either. So that's one area specifically that we're concerned about, is that more and more countries are using it to help fund their sovereign wealth funds and moving those through these funds that already have questions about how they are governed and how they are being used in various situations, whether for reputation laundering and so forth. The second concern with UAE and why it stood out is because UAE's sovereign wealth funds have already been used for gross corruption in the past. And that involves a scandal from Malaysia, known as 1MDB. The US Department of Justice described it as probably the largest kleptocracy case they've ever seen. And it was at least $4.5 billion stolen from a sovereign wealth fund to pay for everything from jewels for the Malaysian Prime Minister's wife to the then Malaysian Prime Minister's election campaign. He's, by the way, now in jail in Malaysia for at least the next 12 years over this case. It paid to make the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. It bought yachts. It threw crazy parties. It hired Hollywood stars to show up at these parties. It's really an insane story. The main protagonist in this was a guy by the name of Jolo. When it became time when he was no longer able to open bank accounts and other accounts because he's in the front page of the New York Times and there's indictments by the Department of Justice. A number of Royals and Gulf Cooperation Council countries jumped in with their reputations and names and one sovereign wealth fund to launder those funds. And that sovereign wealth fund was an Emirati fund by the name of IPIC. So IPIC then, because of the indictments and everything and the attention to it and the arrests and so forth, that fund ended up collapsing. That fund had been established in the 1980s. And when it collapsed in 2019, what was left of it was absorbed into Mubadala. So if you look on various websites for Mubadala's history, it won't say that it comes out of the UAE Offsets Group. It will say it was founded in the 1980s. That is technically true because IPIC, which was founded in the 80s, is part of Mubadala now, but its real story comes from its creation to move offsets. And that highlights the kind of dangers that sovereign wealth funds can have, or because they're treated as low risk, because they're run by sovereigns, because turning down an investment by another country's sovereign wealth fund has real diplomatic implications. They often get a pass in ways that other forms of investment wouldn't, and that would be scrutinized much more difficultly. And so this really highlights what needs to happen. In addition to what Colby and Professor Choi have talked about on the needs of greater transparency in the offsets, greater transparency overall in the international financial system is important. If private equity and venture capitalism and anonymous trusts, anonymous shell companies, if those weren't so common, sovereign wealth funds wouldn't be able to engage in opacity with regardless of what the investment comes from, whether investments from golden visas, defense offset contracts, COVID-19 vaccine proceeds, and a highlighted number of the cases we've put out there. Second, those Santiago principles need to become standards. They need to be reformed, and they need to be reformed with a much broader coalition than just the sovereign wealth funds themselves creating the reforms, but actually civil society. We would argue that the OECD should actually create guidelines for evaluating sovereign wealth funds. And then a third party needs to be responsible for evaluating them. We would argue the IMF would be the appropriate point for that, at least as an initial starting discussion point. So greater transparency overall in a variety of areas where sovereign wealth funds invest, whether those investments come from offsets or otherwise, is really, really important for citizens and journalists and governments and international organizations to be able to monitor what's going on.
Thank you, Jodi, and you've nicely segued into the next section, which is on recommendations. And I will ask the panelists to comment on that, but just for audience members, if you'd like to pose a question, please do so now, because I'll be coming to you in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask the panel, based on the challenges and the risks, but also potential opportunities to combat these risks that you have identified, if you could briefly talk through your top recommendations for addressing some of those challenges. And how to improve and tackle corruption that seems to be endemic in most offsets, defense offsets. And maybe one key piece of advice you would give to a government or policymaker on this issue. Colby, I'll start with you, then move to Professor Choi, and then we'll end with Jodi.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I'm going to move through these quickly because I know I want to have some time for discussions. And I did respond to one question in the question and answer, so hopefully that helps Gregor, who asked that question. So basically, there's 3 key points that we have identified for improving sort of the resilience of corruption and defense offsets. The first one, as others have talked about, is increasing transparency. This is huge. Part of the huge challenge with offset is there's very little transparency. One of the key things, some of the easiest fix is the Commerce Department used to provide more public information on defense offsets, including the countries that were involved, the types of projects. They stopped doing that because companies were complaining that this might affect their competition. I think it's also, the lack of transparency has also affected them not getting deals. So I think we need to sort of rethink what this is, and with the huge push for offsets and the U.S. government pushing for more companies to get into areas that they're not completely familiar with, this is a key way to address this issue. And also say that the Commerce Department and others could do a better job of ensuring that the companies do report. So, penalizing or threatening to penalize them for not reporting. That would be a key one. The second one is the U.S. needs to move away from this hands-off approach to offsets, and they really need to be more active and need to focus on indirect offsets. One of the key things that they can do is there are reporting requirements. The State Department requires companies to report on any political contributions, marketing fees, and commissions associated with an arms deal. They could use that to look at any potential deals that could sort of run corruption risks. The Commerce Department also has tons of information. If Congress could elevate or add the mandate for commerce to not just look at industry, but look at broader sort of U.S. national interests, including corruption, that could improve these efforts. Another thing Congress could do, which I think would be really key, is having the Government Accountability Office do a study. A lot of this information is out there. They can do a study to really dig in deeper and see the specific risks that have come out. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. As far as I'm concerned, the biggest problem we are facing is actually awareness. In South Korea, when I have a discussion about offset, I think many of us surprisingly do not understand the needs, the urgency, the importance of anti-corruption. Why we need to change it? How we going to eliminate offset this is a topic, but they don't really fully understand the scale of the risk or the corruption that offset there can entail. So I think awareness is the one thing that we need to work on. And I think because most of cases arms trade is always done, it's often done in a closed room, so no one knows. It could be personal corruption involved in. So I think when we talk about defense offset, I think everyone and around the world need to be aware of how serious the problem is. So to boost the awareness, I think international community really need to work hard in terms of how we're going to increase the public awareness. And such as the seminar we are doing today would take a very important key role. In Taiwan, in the past, we did have like offset-related seminar. And we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about transparency, and that seminar was more of an educational seminar. So I think a seminar like this and boosting the awareness of offset deals and its difficulties and need to be improved. I think in South Korea, we can hold seminar too. South Korea, we are one of the strongest defense nation, and we can indeed contribute to improve the awareness and contribute to transparency.
Thank you, Professor Choi. And Jodi, did you want to add to some of the recommendations you started talking about in the last set of your intervention?
The only thing I would build on there is, Professor Choi talked about the difficulty of getting people to understand the corruption risk with offsets, which I agree with wholeheartedly. Now we're having the same problem even after the 1MDB scandal, with major scandals involving the Libyan investment fund RDIF, the Russian Investment Fund. We still are having issues with trying to get the rest of the world to recognize the problems with corruption in sovereign wealth funds. So when you combine the two together, it's a particularly complex challenge. So I think working both together, but being able to pull those sorts of issues out, and also bringing in the peace and security issues on the sovereign wealth fund offsets nexus side of things, I think is really important. If I can, I'd be happy to answer some of the questions in the chat if people would like. I didn't know if you wanted me to do that, Sarah.
Yes, we can come to that now, actually, because we've got quite a few questions coming in, if that's okay. If I can get all the panelists to turn their cameras on, that would be really helpful. And while you're doing that, I will start with a question from Frank Vogel, which is to all panelists or whoever would like to respond to this. Have any of the speakers or their organizations sought to define what the boundaries should be for legitimate national security that would set the limits and so permit far-reaching transparency, even if it's not total transparency?
I can start with that. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about transparency in offsets is it's more about company proprietary information than it is about national security issues. So companies are arguing, so, you know, offsets from their perspective, the defense companies, is a key factor in how they win a deal. And they don't want to share any of that information because they're using these different projects options to win that deal. And so I think that is probably a bigger challenge than national security. So one thing I think we can do is we can flip the discussion. Now, there obviously are offsets, particularly direct offsets, and that are related directly to an arms sale, so that are national security. So I think you can, for the indirect, I think we should flip the discussion and say, hey, there's a lot of issues that are actually like national security that shouldn't be under the umbrella of national security. And then even within the sort of more direct offsets, separating some of the issues that are, you know, elevated to key technology that a country needs for its national security. You know, honestly, most of the technology that's given is not that, right? It's lower level. It's more about technology that the importing country wants for building up its exports. So it's not necessarily about, it's rarely about national security. So anyway, thanks.
Would anyone else like to come in on that question?
If I may, based on Colby's wise answer, I suppose in terms of how we reduce anti-corruption, how we reduce corruption in South Korea, defense, I think the Korean Board of Audit and Inspection is vigorously involved, and police is vigorously involved as well. So in general, when it comes to defense business, in terms of corruption, the majority of those officials to posit themselves as Korea is one of the clean area when it comes to defense business. But I suppose in terms of import and export, it does involve massive, huge amount of budget. And that means the entire government is involved and it is carried out very quietly. So I believe policy capture is important. We have got to somehow find a way to stop such a secretary manner to produce the elite group or certain political party to benefit from such defense business. So from national level and international level, it does create a serious problem. So I believe each country need to identify their own possible corruption issue, but we also need to have an integral, a bigger picture, which means that each country's possible corruption can be all pulled into one pot, and so we can see a bigger picture, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to another question, which is, I think, Jodi, directed at you. It's from William McKinsey. Sorry, I might be pronouncing that wrong. Are sovereign wealth funds which hold investments in other countries, the US, for example, required to pay taxes on those investments? If so, does this offer an opportunity to improve disclosure concerning how these SWFs are operating in a particular country?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say hi, Will. He's my former student, so I'm super excited to see him there, at least virtually and on the written screen. So regarding tax, I mean, yes, they would indeed be required to pay taxes. Going through, I mean, the importance of identifying things for the IRS, given the role that tax avoidance, which is legal, and tax evasion, which is not, has on national economies, including that of the United States, and including even on the ability to fund the defense budget in the United States, is significant in its own right. But due to the way that the rules are set up with the IRS, which is very, very, the information given to the IRS is very much boxed so that it cannot be used for other purposes, like, you know, identifying anonymous shell companies or anything. Really, the importance that we focus on in the report is better reporting with the SEC. There is a very, very minimal amount of information that the SEC does require on sovereign wealth funds. My great colleague Lakshmi Kumar wrote a nice chapter on what should happen with sovereign wealth funds and how that the SEC needs to require more information, as do other countries regarding these sovereign wealth funds and where specifically they're invested. And I will note a lot of the information I was able to pull on the foundation, for example, of Mubadala came out of other SEC filings for individuals involved in Mubadala who had to give more information about their backgrounds than I could get from SEC filings on sovereign wealth funds themselves. So it's a little bit like going into the LinkedIn page equivalent to figure out about how the company is created, going through individual employees sort of things. So we would really focus on the SEC, which is going to be much more useful for law enforcement. And of course, the Department of Treasury now has requirements as of the end of December this year that if you have a limited liability company with less than 25 employees, you should be declaring who the beneficial owner is. It is not a public website. It's only available to law enforcement and groups like the SEC, but it is a big start for being able to track offsets or any other issues that we're dealing with in the world. And new rules just came out last week regarding real estate and regarding certain types of investment funds. So we will hopefully, that will help improve some of the environment for all sorts of potential money laundering, illicit finance, and the national security threats that come with them, including those related to those undeclared offsets that Colby mentioned, or when offsets are going to politically exposed persons, when they're going to the brother-in-law of, you know, the head of the company or of a head of the country, or the person actually in charge of the offsets is their side companies and so forth. Hopefully it starts to decrease that. And there's also a question here on adversarial capital to me. And I will just note that this, you know, the use of things like Mubadala allow other national security threats and sort of this foreign money to come into environments that's completely legal. A colleague of mine mentioned that Mubadala had recently sponsored a tennis tournament in her city. You know, putting things up as Mubadala sounds much better than putting things up as this is potential arms-related money from a regime that facilitates the financing of Sudanese genocide and also allows narco traffickers to live freely. Like Mubadala just looks a lot better than, you know, this is really the UAE's money and here's some of the stuff they do. So it forms a set of what we call reputation laundering. It enables through, you know, U.S. subsidiaries to be able to have lobbying and other influence on governments. So I think with the focus on things, you know, we saw yesterday the United States going back against Russian money coming into the United States and influence. 2 days ago, there was China. Casey Michelle, which is a great reporter, just put out an excellent book on foreign agents' influence in the United States. I do hope that with the focus on foreign agents and foreign money and how they influence politics, that will somewhat rub off on some of the offset sides of things as well, because these hidden offsets are a great opportunity to be able to influence governments in potentially very malign ways.
Great. Thank you, Jodi, for also taking Gregory Sanders' question as well. I want to come to Jen Spindle's question, which is to Professor Choi. Do you think that South Korea's use of offsets for military and economic development is a model that could be copied, replicated by other countries? Or were there factors specific to the country that made it able to successfully translate offsets into a strong domestic defense industry?
I am not entirely sure whether we would say as a good case, but what I'm trying to say is due to the nature of offset, I think it definitely benefits South Korea. What it means is without offset deals we had with the United States of America, we would not had that economic development or technology transfer, and without us having the opportunity of domestic production or assembly, those industrial expansion under the umbrella of offset deals between South Korea and US, that Korean economy would not have developed as fast as it had. So I suppose in terms of offset deal, it always is carried out when arms sales involved, and we know that. And I think it depends on each country's economical status and what they expect in terms of making their own weapons or their own independence in national security. Saudi Arabia, Poland, and some other countries who are importing from South Korea, who are involved in offset deal, would obviously consider what would be best deal for them as a seller. And as I mentioned previously, offsets is inevitable. But the problem is the corruption that it entails. So we've got to monitor it. We've got to, on a national level and absolutely on the international level, we've got to make sure it doesn't go any worse than it already is now.
Great, thank you. And I think this also responds to the question Gregory Sanders had as well, in terms of the lessons that can be learned across countries to minimize corruption risks and maximize benefits. So thank you very much. Yeah,
Sorry,
Colby.
if I could just add to what Professor Choi talked about, which I thought was helpful. We talk about some key issues that governments around the world could sort of institute based on our Government Defense Integrity Index and the research we did. And South Korea has a lot of these things. So they have an auditor that's engaged. They actually do enforcement in some cases. Some countries don't. They're very specific about the requirements. They have a specific formula. This is how they value offsets. They, in some cases, have better regulation on brokers. So obviously there's still been challenges, but compared to some other countries, they've established a clear architecture and oversight mechanisms for dealing this. Because of the newness of offsets in some countries or the sort of extreme flexibility, a lot of other countries don't have like a clear system, and they need to. And like that, I think South Korea can help push this sort of big, wider effort to have stronger controls. I mean, there's clear need for more transparency in some of the things that Professor Choi and I have talked about, but there is some model aspects. So thank you.
You're muted, Sarah.
Thank you. I thought I would manage but I did. We just wanted to say a huge thank you to our panelists. I found this conversation very insightful, and I hope those of you joining in the audience did as well. Thank you to the audience members for joining, for your questions, for your comments and feedback. Before you go, if you could please take a moment to complete a quick survey that will pop up shortly. We would really appreciate your feedback. We'll also be sending out follow-up resources by email, and these will be also online in the next coming days. Thank you so much for joining. Have a good rest of the day.
감사합니다.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.